In today's video, we will be taking you with us as we explore an infamous abandoned juvenile detention center with a long documented history of inmate abuse, extreme violence, and it even had a few riots during its heyday.
So we just got ourselves in the abandoned juvenile prison. This is the auditorium. The campus itself is pretty big. Multiple buildings. Pretty wrecked. From what we know and what we've read, it's an old juvenile detention center that was closed a while ago. And now they use the property for paramedic, fire, and rescue training. So there's all sorts of cool stuff here, like car crashes, scenarios set up, helicopter crash through the roof, all sorts of cool stuff. But this is the auditorium. It's got like the squares all over the walls and stuff. Looks kind of cool.
Here's the old stage lights for the auditorium. Surprised they're actually still hanging up there. This place is completely wrecked. There's some murals on the wall still. There's actually a huge truck in the middle of this hallway up here. I don't think you can see it yet, but it's pretty wild. Looks like it's just driven into the building.
The Juvenile Detention Center was built in 1960 on a 55-acre valley site in the greater Washington, D.C. area. When it opened back in 1960, it was also the first correctional institution constructed specifically to house and accommodate those sentenced under the new and somewhat controversial Federal Youth Corrections Act of 1950. This Federal Youth Corrections Act of 1950 was enacted by Congress and targeted young offenders, both men and women, between the ages of 18 and 22. The goal was to segregate them from the more hardened adult offenders and to rehabilitate them through the intensive programs and a mandatory period of parole supervision. Well, in other words, giving the youth offenders a second chance at redemption. The detention center did house young prisoners, both male and female, from adolescent until the age of 22.
So here's one of the more famous scenarios for the search and rescue here. A helicopter crashed into the building. It's pretty wild to see that. It's amazing how they even did that. Pretty cool. So these are some of the cells here for the Juvenile Detention Center. You can see the different colors. Please knock before entering, you dig? This is cell 95. They all numbered 99.
Once these prisoners reached the age of 22, they were then shipped out to the more notorious adult prisons in the area. The design and layout of this juvenile detention center was unlike the design of most previous facilities built by the correctional departments. Built more like a college campus setting, it allowed the offenders to roam freely and give them a sense of freedom of movement, which was meant to deter both aggression and violence. The young inmates were also provided academic and vocational education opportunities, as well as professional counseling and mentorship guidance.
So this is the holding cell of some sort. You see the bars on the window here. People waited on these benches, maybe for showers. Yep, that's it. So this was the showers for the juvenile prison. Pretty dark, but that's what it is, so they would wait for the showers. Some cell bars here. Pretty cool. It's the first cell bars I've actually seen here. I know there's more.
With this idea and initiative of less confinement and restrictions, and with so much freedom and flexibility, the Juvenile Detention Center pretty much had major problems right from the start. In 1963, only 3 years after the Juvenile Center first opened, a group of more than 50 young inmates claiming to be members of the Black Muslim faith group ended up rioting, setting fires, breaking windows, and completely destroying the chapel. These perpetrators of the riots were eventually transported to other jails by bus, and order was soon restored. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, with the influx of the crack cocaine epidemic, the Juvenile Center had become so overcrowded that the Department of Corrections was forced to convert one of the women units to accommodate the vastly growing number of juvenile male offenders. This quick and severe overcrowding would be the catalyst for what would become a near 30-year violent streak within the prison walls, causing the correctional officers to be assaulted over 300 times, which eventually led to much-needed reform in the world of juvenile corrections. And here are some of the real-life cases and facts from the Juvenile Detention Center. October 1980. 7 maximum security juvenile inmates refused to return to their cells to protest the overcrowding and harsh segregation and treatment within the Juvenile Detention Center. The inmates took their frustrations out by breaking furniture and lockers. The inmates were eventually forced back into their cells by armed guards and a whole lot of tear gas. December 1983. Approximately 200 juvenile inmates clashed with over a dozen correctional officers and soon began to break windows and doors, eventually setting fire to several areas throughout the prison. Local firefighters were called to help put out the fires, while local police surrounded the complex and eventually restored order. December 1984. Accidental trouble came knocking on the detention center's door when dangerous methane gas from a nearby landfill began infiltrating the prison's plumbing system and caused several fierce, fiery blasts, which fatally killed one inmate and critically burned another. This accident was a costly mistake and forced the center to be quickly evacuated, and entry was even restricted. An extensive method to vent the gas was installed, and after several months, the inmates were eventually returned. The inmate that survived the blast with both second and third degree burns over nearly 40% of his body was so badly burned that then President Ronald Reagan approved immediate parole and released him. Shortly after he was released, he turned around and filed a $15 million lawsuit against the district for the explosion. November 1985. A 20-year-old inmate at the Juvenile Detention Center was stabbed 11 times by another juvenile inmate and subsequently died from his injuries after bleeding out with no one around to help. April 1986. 11 juvenile inmates were wounded in an early morning melee that started when the facility's power went out. The juvenile inmates began to hurl homemade firebombs and Molotov cocktails, which started 15 separate blazes that went on to burn out of control for over 2 hours. The fires completely destroyed a large section of the education building. June 1986. Violence among a group of approximately 40 juvenile inmates escalates to one inmate being thrown out of a second-story window, and 3 other inmates were seriously injured. Guards again resorted to tear gas to stop the violence. September 1987. The Juvenile Detention Center went into a major lockdown, which meant that all inmates were confined to their cells and were not allowed to move around. The reason for the lockdown was that an inmate was somehow stabbed and shot by 2 other inmates wearing dark ski masks in the prison yard. The young inmate that sustained the stabbing and gunshot wound eventually made a full recovery, but somehow the perpetrators, who were also inmates, were never caught. Within years of its closure, the juvenile center's buildings began to fall into serious disrepair and even dangerous stages of decay, with several buildings even collapsing during that time. Finally, in 2011, approximately 8 years after it closed, it would become the new home for local firefighters, law enforcement, and rescue crews that would utilize the abandoned juvenile center for training and rescue purposes.
Old police targets up in here too. Obviously for the training. So the gym is actually loaded with scenarios. You can see they're all built here for fire and rescue. There's another one there. Here's like a dummy for rescue, I'm sure. Yep, it says the rescue right on there. See? Rescue tech. There's the scoreboard. No spitting on the floor. No smoking, no eating. No boots. And this is a makeshift thing for fire and rescue. Titans racquetball. So they obviously did that here too. And then they had a handball sign right there. Titans handball. Big old tractor in here. This is like some makeshift tower. So nuts.
So this is the main reason as to why you see a helicopter crashed into one of the rooftops, as well as many other simulated vehicle crashes and rescue missions set up to practice real-life scenarios. As of 2022, many local rescue workers, law enforcement, firefighters, paramedics, and first responders continue to utilize the once infamous juvenile detention center to practice real-life search and rescue scenarios. And unfortunately, that'll bring us to the end of the abandoned juvenile detention center video. This place has such a crazy and wild documented history that it made the explore just that much better to experience. So we sure hope that you guys really enjoyed this video. And for more photos from here and other locations, don't forget to check out abandonedcentral.com. And remember, if you haven't already, please subscribe to Abandoned Central on YouTube so that you don't miss any of the latest videos. Thank you all for the love and support.